One day, this artist will put heavy stones into his coat pockets and take his final step toward the river. His last paintings would be called eerie, and critics would debate for years to come. Was he a genius ahead of his time, or a man ultimately broken by life? But that isn't even the strangest part. The strangest thing is that an artist whose story ended so tragically spent his entire life painting the exact same world. A world dominated by sunshine, children, laughter, and absolute serenity, as if pain simply did not exist in it. Why did a man who endured so much suffering return to this very image time and time again? To find the answer, we have to go back to where it all began, to London in the late 19th century. In 1873, in the working-class neighborhood of Islington, a boy named Charles Henry Sims was born. His parents worked as theatrical costumiers and could hardly have imagined that their son would one day become one of the most famous British painters of his era. Yet, while he was still a child, an event occurred that changed everything. A severe injury nearly cost him his life. Doctors managed to save his left leg, but remained permanently weakened. While other children ran, jumped, and played, Charles watched them from the sidelines. He couldn't live the way they did. And that was when something happened that shaped his entire future. He began to build his own world. Not out of wood, not out of stone, but out of imagination. Long hours spent at home gradually turned into hours of dreaming. In these imaginary worlds, there was no limp, no limitations. There was only light, nature, freedom, and happiness. When Charles picked up a pencil for the first time, all of this began to take shape on paper. His parents noticed his talent and supported his passion for art. At first, he studied at the South Kensington National Art Training School in London and later set off for Paris, where he entered the Académie Julian. It was there that he discovered new possibilities in painting, captivated by light, color, and the creative experiments of the Impressionists. A brilliant future seemed to lie ahead of him. But after returning to London, the unexpected happened. Charles entered the Royal Academy of Arts. And he didn't last long there. His Parisian manners, independent nature, and unwavering confidence in his own artistic vision led to conflicts with the instructors. In 1895, he was expelled from the academy, deemed overly arrogant. For most young artists, this would have meant the end of a career. But the story of Charles Henry Sims was only just beginning. Only a few years would pass, and the very people who refused to see his talent would watch his paintings captivate the public, as critics hailed his name as one of the brightest in British art. That was when his greatest dream would come true, and that was when fate would deal him its most painful blow. A very different future awaited the young artist who had been expelled from the Royal Academy for excessive arrogance. Instead of changing who he was, Charles Henry Sims stayed true to his own vision. And very soon, it turned out that this was precisely what the art world had been waiting for. At the end of the 19th century, his paintings began appearing in exhibitions. But these were not merely beautiful landscapes or genre scenes. Sims painted the world as he dreamed of seeing it. A world where children ran carefree across meadows, where sunlight seemed to radiate directly through the canvas itself, where people lived in complete harmony with nature. In 1897, he presented the painting Childhood. At first glance, it was a simple scene of children playing outdoors. Yet this very work brought the artist his first major international recognition. The painting was purchased by the Paris Salon, and today it resides in the Musée d'Orsay, one of France's most famous art museums. That was only the beginning. With every new exhibition, his name echoed louder and louder. Critics praised not just his technical skill, but his extraordinary sense of light. It seemed as though his paintings didn't just reflect the sun, they glowed from within. In 1906, his solo exhibition at London's Leicester Galleries became a true sensation. That same year, a critic dubbed Sims the Ariel of the Academy, comparing his art to light music that grants a sense of freedom. And just a year later, the artist created a painting that many still consider the pinnacle of his work. An island festival, graceful figures dancing, radiant sunlight, and nature itself seeming to partake in the celebration. Critics called this work his masterpiece. It embodied everything he had strived for since childhood: freedom, beauty, harmony, and a life without pain. Interestingly, his own children were most often the models for his paintings. His studio in Fittleworth featured a large window through which natural light flooded inside. While the children played, the artist watched them closely. It was these genuine, spontaneous moments, overflowing with joy, that later came to life on his canvases. It seemed that life had finally given Charles the world he had spent so long trying to paint. And if someone had told him then that very soon he would never paint such pictures again, no one would have believed it. For somewhere far away in Europe, a conflict was already brewing that would alter the fates of millions. And for Charles Henry Sims, it would be more than just a war. It would become the boundary that permanently severed his life into light and darkness. In 1914, Charles Henry Sims was at his peak. His paintings were selling. His exhibitions were admired. He was recognized as one of the most talented painters in Great Britain. It seemed he had finally found the world he had spent his whole life trying to create. Then, a single moment erased everything. In November 1914, disaster struck. The British warship HMS Bulwark exploded in the mouth of the Thames. Among the hundreds killed was the artist's eldest son, John, who was serving as a midshipman in the Royal Navy. For any father, this would have been a tragedy. For Charles Henry Sims, it meant something even more profound. Along with his son, the world he had spent nearly 20 years building on canvas perished. The shift was visible almost immediately. In 1915, he painted Cleo and the children. There were still children in the painting. But now, beside them stood the muse of history. Her scroll was covered with red spots. They symbolized the blood of war. It was the first sign. The artist who had spent his lifetime painting paradise could no longer pretend it existed around him. A few years later, Sims traveled to France himself. Not as a soldier, as an official war artist. He saw firsthand what most people never witnessed. Ruined towns, abandon villages, mutilated land where people had lived only moments before. His new canvases were entirely different. The light had almost vanished. In its place came pain, desolation, and the quiet after battle. Yet his most personal painting was born far from the front line. It emerged in his studio. It was titled Greater Love Hath No Man. In it, the crucified Christ bore the face of his fallen son. This was no longer just a religious painting. It was an attempt to find an answer to the question that haunted him. Why do people lose those they love most? And does this sacrifice carry any meaning at all? From that point on, Charles Henry Sims no longer painted the world as he wished to see it. He began painting the world as it had become. A world where even sunlight could no longer conceal human grief. It seemed things could not get any worse. Yet fate held one final irony. The academy that had once expelled the young painter for his rebelliousness would soon invite him to lead the entire British art world. And that was precisely when the final and darkest chapter of his life would begin. Fate's sense of irony can be extraordinarily cruel. Charles Henry Sims was once expelled from the Royal Academy of Arts, branded an overly arrogant student. 25 years passed, and that very same academy asked him to lead it. In 1920, Charles Henry Sims became the keeper of the Royal Academy of Arts. It was the highest honor a British artist could dream of. It seemed history had finally taken a turn toward justice. Yet sometimes the greatest victory arrives far too late. The new role brought him no peace. Quite the opposite. It only added fresh conflicts. In 1924, Sims painted an official portrait of King George V. However, instead of acclaim, the artist faced a storm of criticism. Rumors swirled that the monarch himself was dissatisfied with the portrait. Following heated debates, the canvas was destroyed. For Sims, this was another crushing blow. Gradually, his personal life unraveled as well. He separated from his wife. His other relationships collapsed as well. Drifting away from family and friends, Charles found himself increasingly isolated with his own thoughts. After stepping down from his post in 1926, he traveled extensively. perhaps searching for new inspiration, or perhaps running away from himself. It was then that his art transformed completely. The painter who once depicted children playing in sunlit fields abandoned his familiar subjects entirely. Instead, he began working on a series of canvases he called spiritual ideas. These works were unlike anything he had ever created before. Light gave way to darkness. Harmony yielded to chaos. Human figures appeared distorted by suffering, and the colors became harsh and unsettling. Some critics hailed these works as strokes of genius. Others saw them as proof that the artist was losing his grip on reality. Charles himself explained these new paintings with a single question: how do you paint a god of love when the world is full of war and suffering? Perhaps that was a question he was asking not the audience, but himself. In April 1928, just weeks before the exhibition of spiritual ideas, Charles Henry Sims placed heavy stones into his coat pockets and stepped off the bridge into the River Tweed. Thus ended the life of an artist who spent his entire existence searching for a world without pain. Yet his story did not end there. 5 years later, the Royal Academy organized a major retrospective exhibition. Visitors moved from one gallery room to the next. In one room, they were greeted by sunny lawns, happy children, and serene light. In the other, the somber spiritual ideas, heavy with anxiety, doubt, and grief. It seemed as though these were the works of two entirely different artists. In truth, they belonged to the same man. Today, looking at the paintings of Charles Henry Sims, it is easy to be captivated by their beauty. If you look closer, it becomes clear that throughout his entire life, he was painting the exact same picture. Not children, not nature, not even light. He was painting his dream. A dream of a world where there is no war, no loss, no pain. And perhaps that is why his canvases still touch people so deeply today. Because every single one of us, at least once in our lives, has dreamed of such a world.